It would have been a gloomy afternoon in Tenerife. Contrary to its usual tranquility, the small airport in the Canary Islands was unusually crowded and bustling, a seemingly harmless detail that turned out to be a cruel twist of fate. "We're taking off now." The captain had already started the plane accelerating down the runway, but they could not have imagined that in the middle of that same runway, another giant aircraft was gradually appearing, startling the captain. In an instant, two Boeing 747s carrying over 600 passengers were engulfed in flames. Horrifying, haunting, and deadly. The most unforgettable chapter in the history of the Dutch national airline, and the airline once considered a glorious symbol of the United States, was once again brought to life. What exactly happened? What was the cause of this tragedy? The pilots, the air traffic control tower. Who was truly responsible for this incident? Without further ado, join us as we delve into the accident considered the most catastrophic in the history of world aviation, KLM 4805 and Pan Am 1736, the fateful flights. And as always, before we dive in, to help the ADB Mysteries channel grow, please give us a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let's begin. 2:10 p.m., March 27, 1977, Tenerife Airport, Spain. A thick fog enveloped the entire airport. On the runway and taxiway, a line of aircraft queued, waiting for takeoff. This situation arose because, in addition to its scheduled flights, Tenerife had to accommodate numerous flights diverted from Gran Canaria International Airport, Spain. A terrorist bombing had just occurred there, injuring one person. Shortly after, the airport director received an anonymous call warning of a second bomb. Due to security concerns, at least 5 large aircraft were diverted and successfully landed at Los Rodeos, also known as Tenerife. Among them was the fateful meeting of 2 Boeing 747s, the largest passenger aircraft in the world at the time. The first was a 747-121, operated by Pan American World Airways as Flight 1736. It had just landed after a long journey from Los Angeles. On board were a total of 380 passengers and 16 crew members. The captain was Victor Grubbs, 56 years old. He was a seasoned pilot with 21,043 flight hours, mostly on the Boeing 707. He had only recently transitioned to the 747 and had accumulated just 564 hours on it. The first officer was Robert Bragg, 39, and the flight engineer was George Warnes, 46. Earlier, upon being notified of the incident at Gran Canaria, the crew of Pan Am 1736 had requested to circle in a holding pattern to wait for landing clearance. But their request was denied as the terrorist situation was not yet fully under control. Parked directly in front of the Pan Am was a more advanced version, a Boeing 747-206B. It was operated by the Dutch national airline, KLM, as Flight 4805, having arrived from Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. On board were 235 passengers and 14 crew members. The flight crew included Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, 50 years old. Working for KLM since 1951, Jacob was considered a model pilot for his skill, mental fortitude, and experience. He had accumulated 11,700 flight hours, with 1,545 of those on the Boeing 747. The first officer was Klaas Meurs, 42. The flight engineer was Willem Schroeder, 48. Tenerife Airport's layout, with only a single runway and a single main taxiway running parallel, connected by 4 smaller taxiways, quickly became overloaded by the presence of so many jumbo jets. The main taxiway became unusable for maneuvering aircraft. Instead, planes had to perform a backtrack maneuver, taxiing down the runway, turning around, and then taking off from the same runway. This procedure would tragically become a primary cause of the disaster. While waiting, KLM Captain Van Zanten decided to take advantage of the delay and refuel the aircraft, rather than waiting until they reached Gran Canaria. He did this partly because of strict Dutch government regulations regarding crew rest and landing times. If they landed too late, the captain would be held solely responsible for the flight, which could even lead to legal issues. Unfortunately, things did not go as he had calculated. Just as the refueling began, air traffic control announced that the situation at Gran Canaria was secure and that the diverted planes could return. With no other choice, the KLM flight was forced to delay its departure for at least another 35 minutes. This delay, in turn, affected the Pan Am jet parked directly behind it. The Pan Am 1736 crew considered maneuvering around the KLM to take off, but they were short by 12 feet, 3.7 nins, to maintain a safe distance in the narrow space, so they ultimately had to stop and wait. The more than 600 people on both flights had no idea that these would be the final moments of their lives. At 4:56 p.m., after taking on 55,000 liters of fuel, the KLM was instructed by the air traffic control tower to taxi the full length of the runway and then make a 180-degree turn to get into takeoff position. The passengers had been called to reboard the plane. This process took a considerable amount of time because a Dutch passenger decided to disembark and stay in Tenerife as she lived there. 6 minutes later, at 5:02 p.m., the Pan Am was also instructed by air traffic control to follow the KLM down the runway and exit onto the third small taxiway to reach the main parallel taxiway. There, Pan Am 1736 was to wait for the KLM to take off before it was its turn. Due to a weak radio signal, the crew initially couldn't clearly hear whether the controller said the first or third taxiway, as first and third sound similar. First Officer Robert Bragg then confirmed, "The third one. 1, 2, 3, third one." After the call, the captain began to taxi the Pan Am slowly down the runway through the fog. The crew had great difficulty identifying taxiways C1 and C2, and they could not identify C3 at all, because the paint on the sign was almost completely faded due to weather and had not been repainted. Having already taxied near the end of the runway, the captain decided they would turn onto taxiway C4, which they could see more clearly. As for the KLM flight, at 5:04 p.m., it had reached the end of the runway and completed its 180-degree turn. Outside the cockpit window, a thick layer of fog reduced visibility to less than 300 meters. The bad weather, combined with the time loss due to the earlier mistake, urged the captain to take off immediately. He had just started to release the plane's brakes when the first officer hastily stopped him. "Wait a minute, we don't have an ATC clearance." A critical issue was that the airport was not equipped with ground radar, forcing the air traffic controller to rely on visual observation. However, due to the poor weather, they couldn't even see the aircraft they were directing. Believing that the Pan Am had already cleared the runway at taxiway 3, the controller transmitted the KLM's after-takeoff clearance. It is crucial to note that ATC had not yet given KLM 4805 permission to take off. They had only provided the flight crew with their departure instructions. However, misinterpreting the ATC's signal, the first officer replied, "We are now at takeoff." At the same time, the captain, frustrated and impatient, said, "We're going." Because all aircraft were using the same frequency, this announcement alarmed both ATC and the Pan Am crew. Before anyone could respond, at 5:06 p.m., the captain released the brakes and advanced the thrust levers. The KLM jet accelerated to a speed of 160 mph, 260 km/h, heading towards the Pan Am, which was still on the runway only 400 meters ahead. In an attempt to resolve the confusion, the Pan Am first officer transmitted, "We are still taxiing down the runway." Simultaneously, ATC sent a message to the KLM. "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." The simultaneous transmissions from ATC and Pan Am caused radio interference. As mentioned, this was 1977, and communication technology was still rudimentary. When two or more devices transmitted on the same frequency at the same time, the sound would be distorted. As a result, the KLM crew could not hear the transmission from Pan Am. Had either message been transmitted clearly, it could have alerted the KLM crew, and it would have remained a beautiful day in Tenerife. But fate had been sealed. 10 seconds later, the KLM began to lift off. Flight engineer Willem Schroeder seemed to realize the problem. Is he not clear, that Pan American? The captain and first officer appeared to ignore this. As the least experienced member of the KLM flight crew, his words carried no weight. 5:06:50 p.m. The cruel fate unfolded as the Pan Am jet was attempting to turn off the runway at the exact moment the KLM aircraft bore down on it. Looking through the cockpit window and seeing the giant iron bird hurtling towards them, Captain Victor Grubbs screamed, "Get off! Get off! Get off!" With all his strength, Captain Grubbs cranked the yoke hard to the side in an effort to steer the plane toward the edge of the runway and avoid a collision. Meanwhile, aboard the KLM, when Van Zanten saw the Pan Am, he knew it was too late to stop. He desperately pulled back on the control column in an attempt to take off early. Just 5 seconds later, the two massive Boeing 747s collided. A deafening explosion ripped through the air. The KLM's nose gear tore through the roof of the Pan Am's cockpit, while its left engine and main landing gear struck the upper right side of the Pan Am's fuselage, nearly ripping it in two. After the collision, the KLM remained airborne for a few more seconds before crashing back onto the runway, skidding for about 300 meters. The powerful impact caused its recently filled fuel tanks to erupt into a massive fireball. There was no escape. All 234 passengers and 14 crew members perished. Aboard the Pan Am, the aircraft also caught fire seconds after the impact. A total of 335 people, including passengers and crew, died in the fire. Those seated in the nose of the aircraft, along with Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Robert Bragg, and Flight Engineer George Warnes, survived. In another cruel twist of irony, when firefighters were dispatched, they initially only saw the burning KLM and did not realize that another damaged aircraft was just 300 meters away. With no other option, 70 people aboard the Pan Am risked their lives by jumping to the ground to escape. Initially, all of them survived the jump, but 9 passengers later died from their severe injuries. Immediately following the incident, about 70 investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, the United States, and the 2 airlines launched a large-scale investigation to determine the cause of the catastrophic accident. The investigation concluded that the primary reason for the accident was Captain Van Zanten's decision to take off without clearance. This fatal error was attributed to his desire to depart as quickly as possible to avoid violating KLM's duty time regulations and before the weather worsened. After much debate, the Dutch national airline ultimately accepted that its crew was responsible for the incident and agreed to pay $110 million in compensation to the victims' relatives. Additionally, numerous contributing factors led to the heartbreaking event, prompting endless discussion and laments of what if. What if there had been no terrorist attack? What if Pan Am had been allowed to enter a holding pattern? What if KLM hadn't delayed its takeoff to refuel? What if the weather hadn't been so terrible? As a consequence of the accident, sweeping changes were made to international aviation regulations. Aviation authorities worldwide mandated the use of standardized phraseology and placed a greater emphasis on English as the common working language. The phrase takeoff is now only used when official takeoff clearance is given. Cockpit procedures were also revised. The hierarchical relationship among crew members was relaxed, emphasizing the importance of crew resource management in final decision-making. Large memorials were later erected in both the Netherlands and the United States to mourn and remember the victims, wishing them peace in the afterlife.